Evening, everyone. We're going to begin the session now. I want to welcome all of you to the launch of this new resource, Making Progress in Prevention Possible, a monitoring framework for the prevention of violence against women and girls in the Asia-Pacific region. My name is Melissa Alvarado. I'm the Regional Program Manager for the Ending Violence Against Women portfolio at UN Women's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, and I will be moderating this event today. I would like to start by welcoming today our distinguished speakers, including Dr. Emma Fulu, founder and director of the Equality Institute, Kim Henderson, director of policy and evaluation at R-Watch, Her Excellency Maria Filomena Babo Martins, the National Director for Gender and Inclusion Policy with the Government of the Democratic Republic of Timor Leste, Her Excellency Nhean Sochetra, Director General for Social Development with the Government of the Kingdom of Cambodia, and Ms. Jayne Harries, Assistant Director of the Gender Equality Branch at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. There's obviously a wealth of expertise among our speakers today, which we know will provide for a rich discussion about prevention of violence in Asia and the Pacific. So I'm going to start by saying a few words about our session today to introduce the session and why we have developed it, why we've invited you to this conversation. And then we'll move into some introductory sessions to bring us all into a common sort of mindset as we begin the conversation. So I wanted to share that we have crafted the session today in the hopes of rewriting the story of violence against women, from one where violence against women and girls is rampant, often feeling overwhelming and unchecked, to one where prevention of violence is possible, and we can feel that there's a change happening and violence is lessening. Thanks to the tireless efforts of advocates, researchers, and policymakers globally, we see that violence against women is preventable and in shorter timeframes than we dared to dream about not so long ago. With this knowledge, we are lifting our ambition to identify prevention approaches that can work at scale, at population levels. You see in front of you on the screen the RESPECT framework for preventing violence against women, which was developed for policymakers really in mind, and was created to share the leading evidence about prevention approaches that are considered effective or promising, and which are not as well, to help guide decision-making, investments, and strategies at the national and subnational levels to prevent violence against women and girls. This is a really incredible new resource which many governments and civil society organizations are already using. We are also very aware that COVID-19 brought with it a host of new challenges and lessons around the pervasiveness of violence against women and the fragility of many response systems worldwide. This was a difficult reality that we've had to face yet again. And the pandemic is also shining a light on the vital importance of prevention of violence against women and girls, and has given us difficult reminders that we need to keep at it. We can't let up. And so despite the harsh reality that violence is very much still with us, we are filled with optimism that we have the tools in our hands now to shape futures without violence at scale here in this region, in Asia and the Pacific, and to help create different outcomes for women, children, and families across the region. So this is what we have gathered everyone here today to reflect on and discuss, and we hope that the conversation and tools we will share today will spark inspiration across the region to scale up investments and efforts in prevention and its measurement. We wish to acknowledge with appreciation the support and funding from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which allowed for the development of this resource and the organization of today's event. So before we begin the session in full, a few housekeeping items. This event is scheduled for 90 minutes, starting from 10 a.m. Bangkok time until 11:30 a.m. Bangkok time. Please note that the session is recorded and the recording will be disseminated afterwards. Microphones of participants will be muted for most of the session to minimize distractions, but you're welcome to use the chat box for your comments throughout the sessions. And please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat so we know who's with us in the session today. It's always good to know who's present. If you have questions or comments, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen and indicate if you have a specific panelist that you would like to ask a question of, indicate which panelist you're interested in directing your question. We will be monitoring the Q&A box throughout the session, and we hope to have time for discussion at the end. But please note we may not be able to respond to all questions, just judging from previous similar webinars. So we're very much looking forward to your contributions. So to begin today's session, I'm pleased to invite Dr. Emma Fulu to give an overview of the latest evidence guiding work on prevention of violence against women, which frames the context of the new resource that we're launching today. Emma, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here and really exciting to be part of this really important panel discussing how we can move forward with progressing prevention work around the Asia Pacific region. I think we've got a lot of exciting opportunities to build upon to take this work forward. So I've been asked first just to sort of set the scene about where we are in terms of the latest evidence guiding the prevention of violence against women and girls. And that's really going to inform the rest of the discussion, and it informs the tool that has been developed and that we're launching today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the founder and executive director of the Equality Institute. My name's Emma Fulu, as Melissa said, and we work on the prevention of violence against women and advancing gender equality around the world. I've spent a lot of time working in the Asia Pacific region as well. And so it's really a real honour for me to be part of this discussion. Next slide. So as Melissa said, I think where we are right now is an incredible moment. Like as she was mentioning, it's really decades of work that have got to this point where we know that violence is preventable. And we actually have really strong evidence to back that up, and strong evidence pointing us towards actions, both from a policy perspective and a programmatic perspective around what is needed to address violence against women and girls. Next slide. Melissa also mentioned the respect framework, and that framework has been really a watershed moment, I think, because for the first time it's brought together this evidence base in a really concise and accessible form for policymakers, which outlines the 7 strategies that can be implemented at a national or regional level to ensure effective prevention of violence against women and girls. And this is really based on strong evidence that's been conducted over the last 20 years, and it outlines core programmatic elements and strategies that can be used to address violence against women. And they align with the letters of respect for those who have not seen this framework before. And it outlines these particular strategies, the first being around relationship skills strengthening. And that can be working with individuals or groups of women or couples to improve their interpersonal communication, conflict management, and shared decision making. And there's strong evidence that that sort of strengthening within those relationships is an important part of violence prevention. The second area is around the empowerment of women, and that refers to both economic and social empowerment, and it includes things related to inheritance, land ownership, gender empowerment interventions, and collective action really around building the empowerment of women across all areas of life. The third area is around ensuring adequate quality services. That's both in the health, legal, police and social services sector. And that really highlights to us the importance of bringing together response and prevention in a continuum of work to be able to provide the support needed to both prevent and respond effectively to violence against women and girls. The fourth letter, P, represents the area of work around reduction of poverty. And we know that poverty in and of itself does not cause violence against women, but we know that it can be a contributing factor, and that those strategies that are targeting women at the household level and trying to alleviate poverty and connecting that with gender equality interventions, and that could be through cash transfers, microfinance loans, labour force interventions, we know they also has strong levels of effectiveness. Then we move on to the letter E, which is around sort of environmental work in making public spaces, institutions like schools, work environments and others more safe. And finally, we can move on to the C and T, so child and adolescent abuse. We know that there's a really strong connection between violence against women and violence against children, and those intersections operate at multiple levels. And so this letter is about establishing nurturing family relationships, prohibiting corporal punishment, implementing positive parenting programs. And there's actually another framework which you may have heard of called the INSPIRE framework, which outlines strategies for the prevention of violence against children. And that really also underpins this work, because we know if we address violence against children and violence within adolescents, that that's going to be preventative when it comes to violence against women because of those strong intersections. And the T stands for transformed attitudes, beliefs and norms. So we know this can come in a variety of strategies that are working to transform harmful norms or gender stereotypes that historically have upheld male privilege and female subordination. And again, those types of strategies can come in multiple forms. It might be public campaigns, group education. We know there's been really strong work in the community mobilisation space that's been really effective as well. So together, these set of strategies provide a really good framework for us to deliver on the opportunity to really reduce rates of violence against women significantly. Next slide. Just to sort of highlight again, there's been some other work done by a number of really important organisations, including the Prevention Collaborative and What Works to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls, and that those programs have really identified some of the core elements across different types of strategies that contribute to their success. As we know, there's no one single solution, but these types of elements, when implemented in different programs, we know that they contribute to the success of those programs. And I'll just go through them quickly. I know I don't have a lot of time, but just recognising the importance of the programs being transformative, and that is that they're focusing on the root causes of violence against women and addressing power inequalities and gender inequality. Other elements is that they're multi-pronged, so they combine strategies working across multiple levels. There's other areas that we've identified in terms of how intensive they need to be. So they need to have high levels of engagement and ongoing support. They need to be inclusive and engage a diverse group of women and men. And they need to also really be aspirational. And I think part of what we're talking about today is that aspirational aspect, and seeing how we can actually have this positive vision for the future and really work towards that goal. So I won't go through all of them, but this is a really good summary of the common elements that contribute to successful programs. Next slide. The other thing that's come out from the evidence is that it's important to think about the underlying guiding principles that drive this work, and that there's a number of principles that, again, they're outlined in the Respect Framework and other documents. And I think we need to remember to keep these in mind in any work that we're delivering. And that's the few ones that I really wanted to highlight is the need to really put women's safety first and do no harm. And that's been really interesting, I think, in the COVID environment, where we've had to rethink some of our approaches and really think about what is going to work for women in the certain situations that they're in, and ensure that we're really prioritising their safety first. The second principle, which of course is a core element of the SDGs and is something I know we're all thinking about, is this idea of leaving no one behind. And in the violence against women context, that means thinking about how do we address multiple intersecting forms of discrimination. So women's experiences aren't all the same. So how are we making sure we address violence against women, not just for the general population, but targeted work, say for women with disabilities, or refugee women, or LGBTQI communities that really address their specific needs and their areas of expertise as well, and what they know in terms of what works in their own communities. Some of the other core principles are around participatory approaches and really trying to promote coordination across the field. And as I noted in the previous one, making sure we link that prevention and response in a continuous approach. And finally, to take a life course approach and understand the different needs of people at different ages. So the needs of girls and adolescents might be very different from the needs of women later in life, and we need to take that perspective when we're developing our programs and policies. Next slide. And this is really my last slide. And it's to think, and we'll go through this in more detail when we look at the framework. But so we've got this sort of programmatic response where we've identified, these are the types of programs that work, and we want to take a holistic approach and include multiple types of programs in our strategies and in the plans that we take at a national level. But in order to do that, we also need this sort of infrastructure underneath that. We need this enabling environment, and both of those things have to work together. And so there is work and there's evidence really to show about the types of enabling environment that require to really support the programming and policy work and make it effective. And some of the things we need to think about in that space is around building an expert workforce, building political commitment from leaders and policymakers. And I know that's a number of people here today are really a testament to that. We need to invest in and build on the work and resource women's organisations who are really been driving this work and have a deep understanding of what is needed in their own communities. At the same time, we need to facilitate the development and enforcement of laws and policies. Obviously, allocation of resources is incredibly important, and ensuring that's sufficient for the scale and scope of the problem that we're trying to address. And lastly, which, again, a key point about today is monitoring and evaluating this work so that we continuously learn and grow and develop over time. Final one, thanks. So just in very quick conclusion, we know, as we said, that violence against women is an incredibly serious and sustained problem, and it has an enduring impact on women's lives. But we know it's preventable. And as Melissa said, we know that it's preventable within programmatic timeframes. And now we have a repertoire of interventions. We've got great evidence. And if we apply that, I think we're in a great position to make a real difference to women and girls' lives. So thank you very much. And over to you again, Melissa.
Thank you so much, Emma. It's so good to have this overview, which really guides our thinking approaches on prevention, and to have it delivered by you. We're so happy to have that opportunity, given your leadership in this field for so long. I wanted to pick up on a couple things that you highlighted in your presentation, which I think are just important to reiterate. One is you acknowledge that the respect framework, which I know we've shared in the chat, and some of you are already looking for and going to that link, is aligned with the INSPIRE framework, and which really just acknowledges all the overlaps between violence against women and violence against children. And I think that there's perhaps a growing understanding and interest in how do we address those issues in complementary ways. How can we take a life course approach that seeks to protect both children and women better? And as you underlined, does so by addressing power differentials, power inequalities, and gender inequalities. to build gender equitable families, relationships, communities. So thank you for that. And I also appreciate that you acknowledge that our work does need to be aspirational. I feel very much reminded of that frequently, that we need to have, really ambitious goals, and we have to be able to work together to hold on to those aspirations and to make progress together. So thank you for all of those key points which you've underlined in your presentation today. We're going to have the chance to hear from Emma in another few minutes. But first, we have the pleasure of hearing from Kim Henderson at Our Watch, which is the leading national not-for-profit organization in Australia dedicated to prevention of violence against women. So Our Watch developed a national prevention monitoring framework titled Counting on Change for the Australian context, and Kim will tell us about this. And so the publication that we're launching today has drawn heavily in terms of inspiration from Counting on Change and adapted to the Asia Pacific region and by the pioneering work of Our Watch. So we're so pleased to be able to hear more about the Australian experience as we move into understanding this regional framework. So Kim, over to you and welcome.
Thanks, Melissa, excellencies and distinguished guests and everyone joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to share our experience today in implementing the Counting on Change framework that Melissa mentioned in the spirit of being aspirational, as Emma and Melissa have both flagged. This is sort of the next step from the framework, monitoring framework that's being launched in Asia Pacific today. So I'm hoping to give you a sense of where you can take this framework now that it's being developed and launched. How can it be implemented, and what does that mean for advancing the work of primary prevention of violence against women? So we recently launched a report called Tracking Progress in Prevention, which essentially is an implementation of our Counting on Change framework. Next slide, please. And today I'd like to talk to you a bit about the background and development of that. Sorry, can I just have the next slide, please? Thanks. And just to give you some of the underpinnings and conceptual framings of that work. So Our Watch, as the National Foundation for Prevention of Violence Against Women, in 2015 developed a foundational document called Change the Story. It subsequently became adopted as Australia's national policy framework for the prevention of violence against women. And in a sense, it's our national version of the RESPECT framework. Change the Story has been built on with a range of other evidence around the prevention of violence against women, and you can see on the slide a series of documents. We then developed a prevention handbook for implementation, the Counting on Change framework for monitoring implementation of that national framework, some new research in masculinities called Men in Focus, and a range of other publications. But I think it's important to understand that Counting on Change builds on Change the Story, and Tracking Progress in Prevention is the implementation of that. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. Just to give you a bit of an overview of the Counting on Change framework. This was developed so that we could capture a full picture of progress, gaps, and areas for improvement in implementing our national framework. It was also to encourage a shared approach to telling the story of our progress in preventing violence against women, to enable us to collectively understand and address the drivers and reinforcing factors of violence against women, and to suggest measures and processes through which we can track progress. If we go to the next slide, you can see a nice visual representation of our monitoring framework in the form of a pyramid. And I think what's been great in practical terms about having this monitoring framework is we've been able to explain, particularly to policymakers and decision makers, that this is a long-term process of change, but that we can look for markers of progress along the way. And we can track how we're going, whether we're heading in the right direction. So if we look at the base of the pyramid, these are the measures that we think need to be put in place, the prevention infrastructure, that if we want to reach the ultimate goal of decreasing prevalence, have to be in place. And in Counting on Change, we look at this happening over sort of 0 to 5 years. That if we get that prevention infrastructure in place, we can then effectively address the drivers and reinforcing factors, which you see in the blue and green in the middle of the pyramid, which will then lead to drops in prevalence and that long-term change. But often policymakers and decision makers go straight to prevalence, which we know will not shift in the short term, particularly lifetime prevalence, but even 12-month prevalence rates take some time to shift. Just a note on our language around drivers and reinforcing factors. I know this is slightly different to what's used in the RESPECT framework and in the region and globally, but there is a lot of alignment there. So Change the Story outlines that there are 4 expressions of gender inequality, 4 gendered drivers that underpin violence against women, and that in order to prevent this violence, we need to take actions to address those underlying drivers, but that violence is exacerbated and the severity is increased when they intersect with reinforcing factors. And you can see some of those in the pyramid. So some of those reinforcing factors might be harmful use of alcohol, for example, but just addressing harmful use of alcohol on its own won't address the underlying drivers. That has to be done together. So over the last 2 years, we, next slide please, we have undertaken research and analysis to address, sorry, someone's knocked at my door, working from home, that's terrible, terrible distraction. We have been working to implement the Counting on Change framework. And what's that has involved is looking at national progress over the decade from 2010 to 2019. Tracking progress in prevention provides a template and a baseline for future monitoring. So we've set a baseline and where possible, we've measured progress against that. If we go to the next slide, the reason that we decided to undertake this work was we felt it was really important as a demonstration to demonstrate what national prevention monitoring could look like in practice, that it was achievable, that it could be done. The report also underlines the critical importance of ongoing periodic monitoring. So we've shown how you can set a baseline and then periodically look at the progress against that. The report's also important because it articulates what successful steps look like and a way to chart against these with interim indicators, as I mentioned earlier. It also makes it possible to keep track of our shared progress, both within states and territories and as an entire country. It helps us to highlight the positive changes, to reinforce the message that prevention is possible, so that we can celebrate these, but also understand what's contributed to these so that we can accelerate progress where possible. It identifies dependencies, gaps, limitations to progress, and areas needing increased attention and effort. And it also identifies opportunities to refine our overall strategy. Finally, it increases accountability and transparency and helps all stakeholders to see themselves and their work as part of a larger collective effort. So I think those points are really critical because it's easy to jump to how are we progressing? Let's see the numbers. But this report is really multidimensional and this process, and it has benefits beyond just measuring progress, as I've outlined there. If we go to the next slide, please. I'll take you now through what we found through that report. So in looking at the prevention infrastructure, those grey boxes that I mentioned earlier, we had 6 domains and 30 indicators that we looked at. And we undertook qualitative and quantitative research to try and measure progress against these measures. These are probably the least developed measures, so we had to do the most thinking and bring our creativity around how we could measure progress against these. So, for example, the prevention infrastructure looks at civil society leadership, political leadership, legislation, an expert workforce, quality programming, and shared evaluative measures. So we did things like looking at the Hansard keyword searches of our parliamentary record to see how many times politicians and which politicians were referring to gender equality, violence against women, prevention. We undertook a stakeholder survey with the workforce to see where the workforce was at. And we did a lot of desktop scans, etc. And what we found, if we go to the next slide, is that there are early positive signs that we're building strong foundations for prevention. So we have a national plan to reduce violence against women, which runs out mid next year. So we're able to see that under that national plan, core prevention infrastructure was built. My own organisation, Our Watch, was established. Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety was established. We had a workplace gender equality agency, broadened its remit to monitor gender equality in the workplace. There was a strong commitment to elimination of violence against women and girls as part of Australia's global commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, we launched our foundational document, Change the Story, which then became the national policy framework. We saw civil society and specialist organisations continue to focus on this work. As Emma noted, women's movements and organisations are critical in this work. And we started to see the beginnings of an emerging multi-skilled primary prevention workforce. Finally, we've seen policy reform across the country. Most jurisdictions in Australia now identify that primary prevention is a priority, and some are beginning to allocate specific funding. If we go to the next slide, where we saw gaps, there was relatively less investment in and attention to interventions that contribute to the structural changes across society. So insufficient development, for example, of shared evaluative practice that would enable us to assess collaborative impact and effectiveness of prevention activity, a limited investment in evaluation frameworks and strategies to evaluate collective and coordinated primary prevention more broadly, just beyond a specific project intervention, for example. And we haven't seen implementation efforts yet translating into mutually reinforcing activities across all levels of society. If we go to the next slide, please. The second part of the report looks at the medium and long-term measures and is more focused on analysing existing population-level quantitative data sets which assess trends over time. We've included descriptive analysis of the quantitative evidence against each indicator and qualitative analysis of findings across the suite of indicators within each domain. There are 11 domains and over 40 indicators in this section of the report, which covers the drivers and reinforcing factors and prevalence, as we see there in the pyramid. And I think what we found was really invaluable was not to just look at each indicator or domain on its own, but to analyse across those to really sense make and tell the story of progress on prevention. I think the other thing to note is that there are limitations to large population data sets, although we're very lucky in Australia to have some gold standard data sets, such as our personal safety survey, such as our national community attitudes survey, our household income and labour dynamics survey. It is important to complement those with other data where appropriate. For example, they sometimes don't break down data by demographic or identity characteristics other than gender. And so where required, we have drawn on additional data sources to more accurately reflect the experiences of a diverse range of women. So just going to the next slide to look at some of the results. We've seen a shift in attitudes at the population level. We're starting to see progress toward a shift in attitudes with continued government investment in our National Community Attitudes Survey. In the period examined, we've seen a reduction in the proportion of Australians whose attitudes condone or accept violence against women, particularly in the period since 2013, an improvement in attitudes towards women's engagement in public life, with increased support for a broadening of the roles available to women and greater acceptance of women's full participation in the workforce. And these encouraging shifts may be the result of increasing numbers of prevention interventions aimed at shifting individual beliefs and attitudes. More broadly, we've seen progress towards gender equality, including increased paid hours of work for women, increased representation of women in public and private sectors, gains in the representation of women in middle management roles, and to some degree, although more limited, increased representation of women in occupations previously seen as masculine or men's work. This progress has been supported by some policy and legislative reform, the introduction of a paid parental leave scheme, for example, and the establishment of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency to oversee reporting requirements for large employers. If we go to the next slide, we've also seen some gaps and some concerning signs of limited improvement in some areas. Australians are still less likely to recognise non-physical forms of violence than physical forms. There's a persistent mistrust of women's reports of violence, with a too high than we would like proportion of people believing that women go through custody disputes to make up and exaggerate claims of domestic violence. A concerning proportion of people still hold attitudes which disregard the need for sexual consent in sexual relations. And many men continue to be influenced by the implicit or explicit expectations of their male peers, which may encourage sexist behaviour within male peer groups. Interestingly, there appears to be a correlation between attitudes supportive of violence against women and other types of discriminatory attitudes, such as racism, and this just reinforces the need for an intersectional feminist approach. And there's much more to report on that, but for time's sake, I'll move to the next slide. So just to give you a flavour of what we found in our analysis of longer term measures around prevalence. So as we expected, the thinking that underpins our theory of change is that these would not move significantly in the 10-year period. And we saw that there have not been large shifts in 12-month prevalence rates of different forms of violence against women by different categories of perpetrator in the time period under consideration. So, for example, 12-month rates of violence against women by intimate partners have remained fairly consistent between 2012 and 2016. But there have been statistically significant changes to a couple of prevalence rates. 12-month rates of sexual violence against women by any perpetrator have increased somewhat, disturbingly. 12-month rates of physical violence against women by any perpetrator have decreased somewhat. There has been a marked increase in 12-month rates of sexual harassment of women. So that just gives you a flavour of some of the findings of the report and the way that we went about it. But I think what's really critical is the analysis of what that tells us. What does that tell us about where to next? And if we go to the next slide, what we've seen through our analysis is that we need a greater focus on actions that drive institutional, systemic and structural change. And to give you a very concrete example, we saw an improvement in the attitudes of men in terms of their desire to take on caring responsibilities and greater parental responsibilities. But we didn't see the policy changes needed to enable men to receive significant parental leave to enable them to do that. So that's where it's really important to ensure that we're working across all levels of the socio-ecological model in a multifaceted way. We've seen that we need an increased investment in and focus on evaluation frameworks and strategies to evaluate collective and coordinated primary prevention impact across Australia. A deeper and broader understanding of what constitutes research and evidence is needed. A stronger focus on masculinity came through, in particular an expansion of prevention initiatives that challenge a rigid attachment to dominant norms of masculinity and that disrupt male-peer relations and expressions of masculinity that normalise aggression, disrespect and hostility towards women. We need increased actions to support systemic reform which address intersecting forms of discrimination and inequality, such as racism and ableism. And there's a need for embedding a gendered approach in work to address inequality and discrimination across all social areas. And finally, we saw that we need a strengthening in the gender policy machinery of government to bring back gender responsive budgeting, which we lost in Australia some time back, and gender responsive policy making across all areas. Just onto the next slide. A really important action that's come out of this analysis is that we need a coordinating body or mechanism to measure national progress on an ongoing basis. So for now, Our Watch undertook this as a demonstration, but we really think it needs to be embedded either in academia or government going forward so that it can be resourced to be undertaken in an ongoing way. Consideration of workforce development in primary prevention activity is really critical. We need to build that workforce. And moving towards longer term and ongoing funding for primary prevention programs and activities that reflect the time periods of frameworks and plans under which they're funded. So we've had a 12-year national plan, but 3-year funding cycles. So we'd like to see a sustained long-term ongoing investment. And finally, strengthening policy governance and coordination mechanisms across portfolios that sit outside of the women's machinery and between levels of government is really critical. And I think a number of those points that have come through in our analysis echoed Emma's slide on the enabling environment, which is really interesting to see that aligning. And just the final slide, I think what we've found is that the report can be used in multiple ways as a measure of progress, as I said, as a baseline, as a demonstration of how it can be done, but it can be used to generate action. It can be used to generate a shared approach that invests in a coordinated and ongoing effort. The report allows us to see where we're making progress and where we're not making progress, why, so that we can adjust our approach and accelerate progress. It can be used by policymakers across all levels of government to help determine the strategic directions for specific primary prevention efforts and for gender equality policy more broadly. It also provides an evidence base to guide effective investment in primary prevention. So it can target actions and investments that we will see more effective and that will accelerate progress. All stakeholders involved in primary prevention can use this report to monitor and adjust their own primary prevention efforts and investments. And it also shows that work to change individual attitudes and behaviours has been limited by a lack of complementary work to address structural and systemic change. And going forward, the report can support efforts to improve that area. And finally, it can be used as an advocacy tool, as evidence, a set of priority actions, and an example of where population level monitoring of primary prevention starts and what it can be in the future. Thank you.
Kim, thank you so much for the insights that you've shared with us and this journey. It's obvious that it really has been very much a journey and an experience of learning right through. And we're very much learning alongside you. So thank you for sharing those insights today. I think it's very important for us to learn from each other. And you've highlighted so many important elements, which I know Emma will speak to next as we talk about the regional framework, which we'll be launching in a moment. So thank you so much for sharing what you've shared and highlighting the importance of intersectional approaches, which will really just bolster our efforts to build gender equitable families and communities workplaces even, and also acknowledging that this really needs to be a shared approach, right? It's not just under the remit of the women's machinery to handle this, right? It's something that really has to be taken up across government, across sectors, and that's really one of the assets that you've shared. So thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate it. Okay, so we're now going to move into the next part of our session today. So I want to say that making progress in prevention possible, the prevention monitoring framework for the Asia Pacific region that we're launching today, was developed by the Equality Institute in collaboration with experts, our watch, you've just heard from Kim and some of her colleagues that she's been talking about their work together, and UN Women. It was designed for policymakers, practitioners, donors, civil society, and academics across the region who are interested in measuring change related to the prevention of violence against women and girls. And I have to say that, we're so pleased to be in conversation with so many donors, so many governments, so many civil society and activist organizations who are really working with the same goal in mind. And so I'm so pleased to be able to ask Emma Fulu at the Equality Institute to introduce the framework. Emma, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Yes, it's really an exciting moment to get to this point. It's been a sort of a long journey for us as well to reach this point of launching this really important framework. And it's so great to hear from Kim, because I think Kim's and the experience from Australia really contextualizes what is possible, because they're one step ahead, having developed this framework and then actually now done the first iteration of monitoring that and developing the implementation around that. So it's so great to hear the experiences from Australia and from Kim, because I think that can hopefully inspire us to see what is possible. So I'm just going to use this time to really give a brief overview about the framework and show you the elements that have been included, and hopefully you can see how it might be used in your own particular context. And we really encourage you to download the resource and start to think about how you might be able to use it. You're going to go to the next slide. I think this has been said many times today, and if we want to take one key message home from the event, it's very clear that violence against women and girls is preventable. We've heard that, and we know what is involved. And I think just to take a step back, what we know is that prevention is really about trying to stop violence happening in the first place. And that requires addressing the underlying causes that drive violence. And Kim was talking about it in terms of drivers and reinforcing factors. We often talk about it in terms of causes and risk factors, but it's those underlying things that we need to address in order to stop violence happening in the first place. And that requires a comprehensive and holistic approach across the prevention and response continuum. And I think what we're in this moment right now where, with COVID, we've seen more than ever that the absolute importance of taking a holistic and comprehensive approach. COVID has, we know, exacerbated violence against women, and it's really made prevention more important than ever. So why this framework? Next slide, please. In the context of all that, I think this framework really helps to address some of those gaps that have been identified. As Melissa said, it's designed specifically for policymakers and practitioners, and it's really designed in a way to meet the needs of the Asia Pacific context, but also create space for it to be contextually, adapted at each country level. I think what it's also trying to do is try and build a consistent approach to monitoring violence against women prevention across the region and bring more comparable data to light so that we can see how we're tracking and that we can support each other across countries to do this work in a way that's most effective. I think it creates space for us to share those learnings and really build and strengthen upon the work of different countries and different communities. one of the things, we've adapted this work obviously from the Counting on Change experience in Australia, and we've made sure that it really aligns with the global and regional frameworks that are relevant for the Asia Pacific region. So obviously that includes the Sustainable Development Goals and that 2030 agenda and the relevant indicators that are identified within that agenda and how they align with the different areas of work around violence prevention. It's also very much aligned with the Respect framework and we'll keep referencing back to that framework as well as we've said, building on the Australian experience of Counting on Change. It tries to really explicitly take an intersectional approach, and I think that was clear from Kim's presentation about how important that is. We've also seen that in the evidence base more globally, that violence against women must be considered in combination with other forms of discrimination and inequality, which intersect with gender inequality. So we know gender inequality doesn't operate alone, and we need to be considering those other forms of discrimination and oppression in order to be able to deliver effective prevention strategies. Next slide. So I'm not sure if you can read the details of this, but this is sort of going back. This is included, we've adapted this again from Counting on Change, and I was involved in the early days of developing working with our watch on the Counting on Change document and framework. And we started trying to develop this diagram because of this issue where we know we want to prevent violence against women. We know the final outcome that we're all aiming for is the reduction in prevalence rates of violence against women. And we measure that, as we know, through various surveys at the lifetime level and at the 12-month level. But realistically, we knew that that goal, while we're all aiming towards that, it's going to take some time to actually see a change in those indicators. And so we were thinking, well, how do we know we're on the right track? How do we document the progress towards that ultimate goal? What types of indicators would suggest that we are on the right path, we're investing in the right things, we're making progress? Where, like Kim said, and where perhaps are we not making progress and we know we need to invest more? So we started thinking about this sort of theory of change, so to speak, to try and build a more systemic and systematic way to measure change. And it's important for monitoring, but I also think it's incredibly important just to be able to tell the story of prevention. Sometimes I think prevention's a bit of a hard story to tell because you're basically trying to, success is the absence of something. Success is the absence of violence against women. And sometimes the absence of something is very hard to measure. And we can get disheartened. If we're seeing, we've been working on this issue for a decade, we've invested all these resources, we've all worked so hard, and still, lifetime prevalence rates of violence aren't changing, or even 12-month prevalence rates aren't changing, that can be disheartening. And so I think the idea was to think about, well, what can we track at an earlier stage to show that we are moving in the right direction? And that can be motivating. I think it can be motivating to continue this journey and to continue to invest the resources that are ultimately needed to prevent violence against women. So what we looked at potentially short, medium and long-term indicators. And as Kim outlined, we thought, and it's really been shown through a number of pieces of evidence, and it's outlined in Respect as well, that at the base, as a foundation, you really need that enabling environment. And so that's the red line here. And we're going to see, that first we need to strengthen the enabling environment. And over time, that enabling environment will get strengthened and it will become strong. And the investment in that over time will plateau because we've kind of built that foundation. As we build that foundation and we're investing in these evidence-based programs, for example, as outlined in Respect, we'll start to see improvements in the root causes and risk factors. So, we'll start to see attitudes towards gender equality improve. We'll start to see stronger response services, etc. And you can see that with what Kim started to share about where there has been some improvements. We have started to see improvements in attitudes towards violence against women, for example. So that's sort of at this level where we're starting to see that change in root causes and risk factors. And that we know we're on the right track if that's happening, because we know prevention is fundamentally about addressing those root causes and risk factors. So we expect to see that improve over time, but we know it's not going to be linear. It's not going to be, a perfect sort of linear progressive change where we see, we had these negative attitudes here and it goes up in a straight line. We know there's going to be up and down movements. There's going to be backlash. There's going to be crises like COVID. Things are going to move up and down. But overall, we want to be heading in that direction of improvements in the root causes and risk factors of violence. The third line there is that actually what we hope to see is an increased demand for formal response services. And again, reiterating this need for the connection between prevention and response. And I think sometimes we've seen that in the region where we've seen an increased demand for response services as they've become more accessible, as the quality has improved. And some people might think that's a bad thing. That means that violence against women must be increasing. But the opposite is actually true. First, we're going to see an increase in response services, and that's a good thing. That means the services improved. It means women feel safer coming forward. It means perhaps the shame and stigma around seeking help has gone down. And so we will see that actually increase over time before it starts to plateau and eventually drop off. As the actual prevalence rates start to decrease, then obviously response, sort of demand for response services will decrease. And then as you'll see here, it's really not over the short and medium term. We think that this is going to be reasonably static. And I think Kim has shown that to be the case from what's been coming out of the data in Australia. It's going to be reasonably static in the short and medium term. And it's only when all of these other things are in place, we've got the enabling environment, we've started to see improvements in the root causes, demand for formal services has gone up, then we will start to see, actually, we've done all of these things. First 12-month prevalence will likely go down before lifetime prevalence eventually goes down. So this is sort of a representation of what we think change is going to look like. And that's through this sort of model, we've then been able to identify, okay, what are some indicators along the way that are going to help us measure that? So next slide. And it's the similar model that Kim showed with the pyramid. We're looking at short-term measures to measure that enabling environment that we've talked about, then medium-term measures to measure those root causes, and then finally long-term measures to actually measure prevalence. So aligned with this SDG agenda and the respect framework and building off counting on change, we identified these 8 core short-term measures, sort of elements that we should be measuring to see that the enabling environment is being strengthened and is progressing. And in the full report, you'll see we've actually identified some principles and potential indicators aligned to each of these areas or domains of change. We're trying to see change in these areas. We've identified some indicators that could be used to measure that. But as Kim noted, the existence of consistent measures around these areas is quite limited. And there's going to need to be some creative work to actually, at a national or regional or subnational level, look at what might work in terms of measuring these things. But ultimately, you want to be measuring, is the workforce around prevention growing? Is there political commitment from leaders? Do you see greater investment and support for women's organisation? Are you seeing enforcement of laws and legislation? Is there a strong coordination mechanism? Do you see the evidence base growing? And are the number of programs increasing? So they're the things you can start to measure in the short term to know that actually, yeah, we're on the right track. We're strengthening the enabling environment and things are moving forward. Next slide. The second set of measures outlined in the framework address these root causes or risk factors. And, you know, Kim talked about drivers and reinforcing factors. In this one, we're talking about causes and risk factors. As we know, the underlying cause of violence against women and girls is gender inequality. And we've identified from the evidence base what are the elements of gender inequality that are actually contributing to violence against women. Sometimes we think about gender equality or gender inequality as this sort of broad brush generic thing, but it actually manifests in lots of different ways. And there's certain manifestations of that drive violence against women more explicitly. And these, based on the evidence, these are the elements that are really important in terms of their contribution to violence against women. And these are the things we should be addressing and measuring. So you want to be obviously advancing gender equality, reducing the justification of violence. We know that attitudes and beliefs that justify, condone, or minimize violence actually contribute to higher rates of violence. We want to be looking at women having greater decision-making power, and there's ways to measure that. We want to look at gender roles and that they're becoming less rigid. And again, this idea around masculinity and positive expressions of masculinity, as Kim said, is an emerging area that needs more work as well. And this work around creating equal and respectful relationships. And then alongside that, there's other factors that we know contribute to violence, whether that's around mental health issues, harmful use of alcohol and drugs, backlash, economic inequality, child abuse, child protection issues, and broader experiences of violence. So that's a suite of measures that we need to look at and see track change in the medium term. Next slide. And finally, this is, where we're all trying to get to, is reduction in rates of violence. And we know that there's indicators on the SDGs around these, and with the indicators that we've recommended are aligned with that. But again, we know that this, while we will continue to measure this, we might not expect to see a change at this level for some time. And that's why the other two levels are incredibly important to make sure that you're heading in the right direction. Next slide. I know I'm coming up on time, so this is just one single example of some example indicators that we've provided in the report. Again, as far as we can align to the SDGs and other measures that are commonly used across the region. So for example, just to break it down a little bit, if you're trying to see, okay, is gender equality advancing? Are there some indicators that we can look at that, that measure that? And one of the areas you might look at is equal access to inheritance, marriage, divorce, and healthcare rights, because we know that from the evidence that they are important. And then you could look at the indicators that, for example, align with that. And you might look at measuring the total adult population with secure tenure rights to land. And again, this is aligned with one of the SDG indicators. You might look at maternal mortality ratio. And alone, I think as Kim said, alone, this might seem, how is that related to violence against women, just looking at the mortality, maternal mortality ratio? But if you, in the context of all the other indicators and the domains of change, it's going to tell you a story that you're moving in the right direction and that you're addressing gender equality. And so that's the important part. It's not just that one indicator alone can be, can be assumed to be contributing to an end of violence against women. It's the combination of these things together that tell a holistic story. Next slide. And lastly, just to note, obviously we've designed this framework to be regional, and therefore in some ways it's broad. It has to be broad to meet the different needs of different countries. But we recognise in the final sort of chapter in the framework sort of goes through some things to think about when it comes to national implementation, because ultimately any prevention strategy and monitoring framework is going to need to be adapted to the national context. And so there's important guidance on that as well. Next slide. Just again, in final conclusions, really, we know what our ultimate goal is. We know that we want women to live free from violence. But in order to meet that goal, we need to track progress, and we need to look at changes in the short and medium term, and we need to measure those changes. And really what I want people to leave with is this idea that there is a compelling prevention story to tell. It's not just this final number. And if we can tell that compelling story, and if we can track that, it's going to motivate all of us to continue the investment that we need in prevention, because you're going to be seeing that incremental change. So I think it's an incredibly powerful advocacy tool, as well as what, Kim noted that, as well as a monitoring tool and a place for us to set a clear baseline and continue to build our learning over time. I'll leave it there, and thank you very much. And I really do hope you find the framework useful and that it can support the incredible work that I know is happening all around the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. It's so good to hear from you and to have you present this framework to monitor population level progress on the prevention of violence against women and girls. I mean, there's just a ton of great information that I know we're all going to take away and utilize and keep talking about following this session. And I want to just highlight a couple things. One, I appreciate that you acknowledged that many of us here, and I think many of us who are interested in this topic and have joined the session today, have a common interest in understanding, are we investing in the right things? We have limited time, we have limited money, we have limited people with expertise. So are we putting our energies in the right places? I think we're often asking ourselves that question. And I think this framework really tries to help us answer some of those questions. Because we're all working in an environment with just limitations. And we do see that when we can observe progress, that is motivating. It's motivating for governments, to keep making those investments and to keep refining knowledge and evidence. And we also appreciate that a number of countries are already collecting some of these types of data. You've acknowledged that prevalence data is clearly a really critical indicator for us to all understand and track, but it's not the only one. And a number of countries are already collecting quite a few of these indicators. And so it's good to see where the connections are to understand progress in prevention. So thank you so much for outlining some of those various angles that are all part of this common story. So I now have the honor of introducing two distinguished speakers, Her Excellency Director Maria Filomena Babo Martins from the government of the Democratic Republic of Timor Leste, and Her Excellency Director Nhean Sochetra from the government of the Kingdom of Cambodia. These governments of Timor Leste and Cambodia both have national action plans to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls. And we're so delighted to see these countries continue to refine and improve these national level plans. We appreciate that both national action plans foresee multi-sectoral implementation and have been developed with extensive consultation and buy-in from a range of stakeholders in these two countries. UN Women has been a proud partner of both these countries for many years on preventing and ending violence against women. So I'm now pleased to offer the floor to Her Excellency Director Martins to share with us some insights and a quick overview of some of the angles related to the National Action Plan on Violence Against Women in Timor-Leste. So the floor is yours, Your Excellency.
Yeah, you can look at the slide here. Look at it again. Oh, yeah.
Yes, I think we can see your slide now.
Thank you very much, Ms. Melissa, for the opportunity. Now I'm going directly to my next slide. Here you can see my here's an introduction to you all. My respect to you all, Excellencies. To tackle gender-based violence and domestic violence in Timor Leste, or we can say VAW in Timor Leste, we have this framework, government resolution number 25, 2017, on approval for national action plan on gender-based violence, 2017-2021. And then we also have dispatch from His Excellency Prime Minister, number 259, 2019, on the nomination of Inter-Ministerial Commission for the implementation of monitoring and evaluation of National Action Plan on GBV. That then we have the National Action Plan on GBV. Our focus is on 4 important pillars. The first is about prevention of gender-based violence in Timor Leste, and the service provision to victims, access to justice, and coordination, monitoring, and evaluation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And then talking about responsible of the government on GBV, we have 5 government ministries and 1 Secretary of State. They are responsible for allocating the budget for the implementation of prevention of in Timor Leste. Then we have a responsible government. They are using available resource to raise the awareness of people from national, local to remote areas. Next slide, please. Talking about Inter-Ministerial Commission was established in 2019. It's composed or consists by the 18 government institutions and 3 civil society organizations. And Secretary of State for Equality and Inclusion leads the Interministerial Commission. Next slide, please. We are talking about coordination mechanism on data collection. Secretary of State for Equality and Inclusion leads regular annual meeting of Interministerial Commission in actualizing and monitoring the NAP GBV. So here we have three regular meetings a year to talk about coordination mechanism. Facilitate regular meeting on advocacy network and a strategy to prevention and response on to gender-based violence. We have a referral network that we have regular meeting 4 times a year per the trimestral meeting to guarantee protection, social services, security, and justice. We also have a regular meeting on gender equality coordination 3 times a year that involving all development partners, civil society organization to actualize and strengthen services coordination on prevention and data collection. Please, think these are this is my presentation, so I'm ready for comment or any questions that we are going to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. It is really inspiring to hear about the progress that Timor Leste has made in terms of getting broad support for this National Action Plan. We've been following your journey quite closely, and we see that you've been able to get not only ministerial support across several ministries and with the Secretary of State, but the National Action Plan has also been launched and approved at the Prime Minister level, and that you have an interministerial commission, which is really driving progress as well as monitoring. And we know that those are all critical elements to be able to track progress. And so I have a question for you, and I'd like to link this to another question that someone has put into the chat. And so the question is, what has enabled prevention of violence against women and monitoring or measuring your prevention activities in Timor Leste? What do you feel allows progress to happen? And there was a question related to whether it is, whether having a national mechanism on violence against women is really key, or maybe having key ministerial support. So I'm curious to hear what you think about some of those questions.
Prevention mechanisms that we have in Timor Leste, as I said in my presentation, we have a referral network to coordinate all these measures, how to tackle gender-based violence in Timor Leste. And then we have also worked together with other line ministers, civil society, to maintain women economic empowerment, to reduce poverty, and to stop violence against women. Also promote gender equality in legal and policy levels. And then we have community leaders, men and women, government officials and teachers. They have knowledge on human rights, gender equality, and gender-based violence.
Very good, very good. That is so good to hear from you. Thank you for underlining those points. I appreciate that you acknowledged a couple really important, let's say, ingredients. One is close cooperation with civil society organizations. I'm aware that in Timor-Leste, there's a strong cooperation between government and CSOs, which we know really drive so much progress. And you also highlighted the importance of connecting women's economic empowerment with reducing violence against women. And that is something where we see really important evidence in some contexts that when we're connecting those two issues programmatically, we can see really important progress because these are connected issues. And that's certainly an area that's featured in the respect framework. So thank you so much for highlighting this. And I know that in the context of COVID, understanding that, poverty and economic impacts of COVID are very much connected to experiences of violence as well. Okay, I'm gonna thank you so much for what you've shared with us. And just in being conscious of time, I'm going to request the next speaker to share with us. So thank you so much. And if there's an additional question, I will turn to you. So thank you so much, Your Excellency Martins. So I'm now pleased to open the floor to Her Excellency Director Sochetra from Cambodia, who will share insights from the Cambodian context. And I know that she has some insights to share with us. So Your Excellency Sochetra, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Good morning, ladies. Good morning, Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to express my appreciation to you and women for bringing me to this this important panel discussion and to share with you about the overview of the National Action Plan on Violence Against Women in Cambodia and its prevention components. With the leadership of the Ministry of Women Affairs, the third National Action Plan to Prevent Violence Against Women for 2019 to 2023 was approved by the Council of Ministers and launched in early of these years in January 2021. And its priority build on the success of the second National Action Plan in developing minimum service standard and step priority to respond to remaining challenges through strategies in prevention, legal protection, and multi-sectoral service response, legal law and policy, and monitoring and evaluation. These are the four key strategies of our current National Action Plan. And in the third National Action Plan on Violence Against Women, the Technical Working Group on Gender-Based Violence has prioritized a review of the law on the prevention of domestic violence and prevention of domestic protection of domestic violence and prevention of the victim to guide a strategy for its revision. And so far, initial steps have been taken to conduct internal analysis of the existing challenges. However, now we have a clear path or strategy have been developed to guide the reform priorities. And I would also want to highlight the functioning of the Technical Working Group on Gender-Based Violence. With the leadership of the Ministry of Women Affairs, the Technical Working Group on Gender-Based Violence has become a national mechanism to mobilize participation from 17 line ministries to take action in response to gender-based violence and violence against women. For example, all 17 line ministries are developing their own annual operational plan to implement the third National Action Plan on Violence Against Women and advocate for resource and national budget allocation for implement their activity. Since the National Action Plan on Prevention of Violence, since the second National Action Plan, it has been recognized from all 17 line ministries that the work to respond and prevent violence against women is seen as the inter-ministerial action plan. And in terms of prevention, it has observed that it has more and more effort from different line ministries, such as the Ministry of Education, Youth and Sport, Ministry of Post and Telecom, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Social Affairs, and also with the National Action Plan on Violence against women. We plan to reach out more to the Ministry of Religion and Caste, as we have learned that the faith-based organization or institution have a key role to play for addressing violence against women. So the Ministry of Women Affairs have worked with our key stakeholders, including the civil society and the development partner as our key partner to implement the social behavior change campaign. We have engaged with the global campaign such as UN Unite campaign targeting young people in university and high school to address negative social and gender norms. Additionally, we implemented a Good Man campaign and a White Stop campaign during the 16-day campaign to prevent to stop violence against women and girls. And we also address gender stereotyping and discriminatory comment among media. And the Ministry of Women Affairs has joined the MOU with the Ministry of Information on Media Code of Conduct for reporting violence against women. We conduct workshops and training with journalists, TV show hosts, news commentators to understand challenges and cause of violence against women and how to address ethically when comment or report on case related to the media. Currently, with the challenge of the COVID-19, we are adopting new normal to use a virtual platform such as social media and virtual dialogue to engage with key stakeholders, including the line ministry, the development partner, and the civil society to discuss the interrelation of the violence against children and the violence against women and girls. It seemed to be a very engaging by the audience as well as the stakeholders. And the Ministry of Women Affairs conduct initiative to engage young people to use their knowledge and talent to address violence against women and gender-based violence through media context and enabling young people to reflect and utilize their potential to eliminate gender-based violence and also violence against women and violence against children. So I would like to share with you about what we have done in terms of prevention of violence against women and the overview of our current national action plan. And I'm happy to listen to you. If you have any more question, I'm happy to answer you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. I think that you've really highlighted some of the factors which have perhaps been enabling in terms of allowing progress on prevention in Cambodia. I made some notes here about the fact that you have 17 line ministries who are part of this plan and who are committed and active members of this national action plan. That's quite an accomplishment to get such a broad ownership across government and with even the Ministry of I didn't get the correct name, but you've engaged your ministry that deals with religion and faith-based organizations. We know that dealing with those types of faith institutions can be very powerful, and in many contexts is a key strategy to be building support for gender equitable relationships and families, and knowing that those are such important opinion leaders. You've also talked about the importance and your strategies to engage young people as well as media. And so I know that those are just a few of the many actors that you've highlighted, but it's clear that your department and your ministry is working very hard to really create a sense of shared ownership about the need to prevent violence against women and girls. So thank you so much for those various approaches that you're taking. I think that we very much are learning from your experience in Cambodia, and I appreciate you sharing that with us today. So I'm conscious of the time. We're already almost at 90 minutes. And so I want to ask if participants could stay with us for just a few more minutes. We have a couple questions that have come in to the chat or to the Q&A box, which we wanted to address. And so just very quickly, I thought we would speak to a couple issues related to intersectionality, because that's come up a couple times. And I'd like to invite perhaps Emma Fulu to maybe just say a few very, very brief words about that, since that's an approach I know that we've been discussing quite a lot within the framework So would you like to say a few things about that, Fulu?
Sure. Thanks, Melissa, and thanks for the question. Yeah, I think, look, it's a complex area, and I know it's a bit of a buzzword that we hear this term thrown around, intersectionality, and I know that it's not as simple as it may seem. I think what we know is that obviously gender inequality is the underpinning cause of violence against women, and we need to address that. But the reality is that that intersects with all of these other forms, whether that's issues of racism or socioeconomic injustice, etc. And unless we also simultaneously tackle some of those issues, we're not going to be effective in preventing violence against women. What that looks like in practice is obviously going to be different in different country contexts. But I think one of the areas that has shown success is when you're thinking about doing prevention work with communities that do face multiple forms of discrimination or marginalisation, that you work with those communities and that the work is designed and driven by those communities who understand their own needs, understand the issues they're facing, and understand the most effective solutions. So I think that's one. There's no simple answer of intersectionality looks like this, but I think it's recognising, okay, in our country or in our community, these are some population groups that we know are perhaps facing increased vulnerability or a particular risk. We've seen some of that in COVID. And so let's work with them to develop solutions that do address those intersecting forms of discrimination. So that's quickly, and I think in the framework we do talk a lot about that. So hopefully there's some more tips and pointers there.
Very good. Thank you so much, Emma. And it's true. I mean, I think we're all learners in the space related to prevention, as well as what can we do to be as inclusive as possible. And we know that, certainly a starting point is to make sure that we've got diverse representation and we're consulting with diverse communities as we design and as we implement and as we evaluate. So at all those levels, that's critical. So thank you so much for that, Emma. I'm still conscious of time, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to provide some commentary back to one of the questions related to how do we address male-dominated structures within the state. This was a very good question that came from Bangladesh. So I thought I would see if, Kim, if you wanted to speak to that, just drawing on the experience you've had there, recognizing that many of the institutions that we want to be engaging with are male-driven and do have, very strong sort of, male-driven structures. So would you like to speak to that question briefly, Kim?
Sure. I think, that's a complex question, isn't it? And we could talk about that for a while. So I'll try to give a brief answer that's not overly simplistic. But I think really if we go back to the basics of primary prevention and our principles and approaches, it's really about taking a multifaceted approach. And so you can engage at multiple levels and in different ways within an institution. So it's about that work to change hearts and minds, to change attitudes, mindsets and behaviours, but addressing that at the same time as we're looking at not only organisational culture context, but also organisational policies, processes and systems. And then at the more macro level, what are the policy levers? What are the legislative frameworks that could be tweaked or pulled to create a more enabling environment for that sort of change, like quotas, for example, just to name one. So just a really brief response there. I think I've just emphasised looking right across the socio-ecological model, looking at all those intervention points and looking at multifaceted approaches to have the greatest impact, even if we're looking just within one institution.
Very good. Yes, absolutely. And we know that one of our first sort of tasks as we engage in stronger, more robust, more effective, both response and prevention is to work internally within many institutions. Maybe that's the police, maybe that's the justice system, maybe that's the health sector, social welfare. So in each of these institutions, we know that there's a really important sort of alliance building that we want to be doing. So thank you so much for your insights there, Kim. So we will move to the next phase of this session. And I want to thank all of you for your engagement throughout this session, all of the speakers and presenters, all of the participants in the audience, and really to all the distinguished speakers, we really appreciate your time and your insights that you've shared with us today. We are very hopeful and confident that the conversations like this one today will help us move together in the direction of purposeful and effective prevention of violence against women, and increasingly more so at scale. So I would like to now invite Ms. Jayne Harries from the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to help summarize today's session and offer closing remarks. So Jayne, the floor is yours. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to the UN Women Asia Pacific Regional Office for organising this really informative and insightful event today. And thank you everyone for your engagement in this important discussion. I think it's been really, really useful. I wanted to say a special thank you to our presenters, Dr. Emma Fulu, Kim Henderson, Her Excellency Director Maria Filomena Babo Martins, and Her Excellency Director Nhean Sochetra. The knowledge and the insights and lessons that you've shared with us today are so valued and appreciated. It's through dialogues like these that we can really share and learn together on what works to end violence against women and girls in our region. The important message that you've outlined for us today is that prevention of violence against women and girls is possible, and it's possible within programmatic timeframes. Thanks to the growing evidence on what works to prevent violence, we now have a range of prevention interventions that we know are effective, that can be adapted and taken to scale. We've heard from our speakers today that we can design prevention initiatives that are robust, targeted, holistic, and comprehensive, and that these can address underlying gender inequalities that drive gender-based violence. And we have tangible examples of where this is being done. And it's by using frameworks such as those discussed today that we can monitor the outcomes of these interventions, to track progress, to identify those areas that require attention, enabling us to maximize impact, advance progress to ending violence against women and girls, but also importantly to track this progress and share the knowledge and insights so that we can build the evidence on what works to prevent violence in our region. We also heard about the great work that is being done in Timor Leste and Cambodia to implement national action plans to prevent and address violence against women and girls. The work that is happening through these plans to support coordinated and multi-sectoral actions across government and society just demonstrates what can be done to drive positive change. So again, a special thanks to our special guests, Her Excellency Martins and Her Excellency Sochetra, for sharing with us the important prevention work that you are doing. Australia remains committed to ending violence against women and girls domestically and internationally. And it's through continued delivery of essential services alongside violence prevention efforts to address the underlying causes that we're doing this. COVID-19 has highlighted the need for us to take this long-term view, to address those gender inequalities that have been exacerbated during the pandemic, such as the exacerbation of gender-based violence, so that we can build back better and equal. Today, we heard that if we truly want to end violence against women and girls, we need to ensure primary prevention is an essential component of our approach, incorporated alongside response efforts. So recognising the importance of this, Australia is very pleased to support UN Women with this important work of violence prevention in the Indo-Pacific, including the development of this great framework that's been released today, making progress in prevention possible. We welcome the framework, which we see as providing really helpful guidance on how we can implement prevention approaches and monitor these to help us tell the good story of prevention. Together with the Respect Framework, this monitoring framework presents a useful toolkit for policymakers, for practitioners, funders and organisations like yourselves and us to build a prevention approach that is achievable, tangible and contextually relevant. So we look forward to working with you all in implementing these useful tools to step up prevention efforts in the region so that we can work together to end violence against women and girls. As mentioned at the start of today's webinar, just a reminder that this has been recorded and the link to the recording will be sent out via email following. And just a special thank you again, all of you, for joining today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jane, and to all of the speakers and presenters today. You are very welcome to reach out to us to discuss the framework or future prevention work in your contexts. We will have a slide that we're sharing which has some contact details. You're very welcome to send us an email or reach us on social media. And as Jane noted, we will be sharing the recording and materials shortly. So thank you so much for joining us. We wish you a good day, a good evening, wherever you are, and we look forward to our next encounter. So long.
Thank you.